Welcome to this lecture for Research Methods. We'll be talking today about conducting ethical research. So overview of what we'll talk about, why ethical standards are needed, where ethical standards for research come from, some guiding principles for conducting research, also for reporting research, and then a little bit of information on conducting research with non-human subjects. So why are ethical standards for research needed? Primarily to protect the rights and welfare of research participants. And we know this is needed because when there weren't research standards, or there weren't as many research standards, some research that would now be considered unethical was conducted. One of the well-known research studies from social psych is the Stanford prison experiment. And this wasn't an inherently unethical study. This is one that you've probably heard of where they had college students who were randomly assigned to play the roles of either prison guards or prison inmates, and they had to shut the study down eventually because people took it a little too seriously. But one thing that they didn't do was let people quit right when they decided they wanted to quit. Like pretty early on, people said, "No, this isn't cool. I don't like this. I want out," and they coerced them to keep going, keep playing along, and that is considered unethical. A bit more serious, before that you have the Nazi experiments in concentration camps, a variety of experiments on people who had been taken prisoner, largely medical experiments, which would mostly be characterized as torture, seeing what kind of things can the human body endure. Which this is something that's clearly unethical, but the only ethical dilemma that surrounds these studies is the information gathered from them. So they're already done. They're done in the past. The people responsible have been punished. Right, in the post Nuremberg trials, they had special trials for the doctors involved. Can you use the information they learned? Like if they learned something that could be used to save lives, but you got that information from this kind of poison tree, right? A bad source. Is it now unethical to use the information? Do you need to go redo the research in an ethical way? And that's something that continues to be talked about to some degree. But clearly, having research participants that had no right of refusal and doing horrible things to them is clearly unethical, and there need to be standards to protect that. More recently, and here in the States, some of you may be aware of the Tuskegee syphilis study, one of the more shameful chapters in of our scientific history. This is where, in the U.S. South, researchers were interested in what the course of untreated syphilis was in black men, and they thought perhaps that the course was different in black men than in white men for some reason. And so they recruited men who had syphilis. I mean, fortunately, they didn't inject them with it, but so it could have been worse, maybe. But men that had syphilis, and they told them, "Hey, come be in the study, and we'll give you medicine." So they misled them, letting them believe that they were being treated, and in fact they were being denied treatment. They were just getting blood draws, and even when people questioned it, they pushed back, said, "No, we're taking care of you. Don't worry about it." So really unethical for a variety of reasons, and this is one of the things that we'll see in a bit was instrumental whenever the study came to light in changing the way we do things and getting some standards in place. So without standards, bad things happen, right? Researchers will take advantage of people, right? And some people may think, well, not anymore. We've moved past that. We could probably roll back some of these standards. And I would argue, no, people are still people, and there are still some pretty intense pressures on researchers to get their research done, right? If it's in academia, to keep your job, for many it's publish or perish. You need to publish something or you're not going to keep your job. For those in the private sector, you need to be finding the results that the people paying for your research are looking for, and saying that their drug works, or if it doesn't work, telling them why it doesn't work as quickly as possible. And there's a lot of pressure on people to find answers, right? There aren't any more what's the term? Scholars of leisure, that people, oh, there's interest in science and doing it for fun. That doesn't happen. Usually it's related to people's income, so there is pressure to do it. So no matter how far we've come in our understanding of scientific ethics, without some standards in place, people will go as far as the rules will let them. Okay. So in addition to protecting people, it's also important to have standards to protect the accuracy of scientific knowledge, right? Which again, going back to that pressure to publish and a variety of reasons why people may not be accurate in the reporting of their research and falsify research. One fairly well-known example, Andrew Wakefield, the guy who had one of the big studies showing the linkage between vaccines and autism. If you go back and look at his research, it's a laundry list of ethical violations. Some creepy stuff, paying kids at his own kid's birthday party for blood draws, hand-picking kids to be in certain studies without documenting justification for why they were included, not disclosing the source of his income related to his research, and that he was basically getting ready to profit off this research that he was doing. Lots of these things. And ultimately it was also found that he falsified several elements of his results. So we have to have these standards in place so people can't just make stuff up, right? Because policies, decisions are made based on scientific knowledge. And if that knowledge is contaminated with fraudulent studies, that's problematic. So there needs to be ethical standards there and things where you can hold people accountable. Like this Wakefield, I think he lost his ability to practice medicine in the UK and a variety of other consequences because of his unethical research activity. Related to that, ethical standards are needed to help protect public confidence in research, right? If stories of abuse to participants and deception kind of grow, people begin to not trust researchers, right? They won't participate in research studies, or if they do participate, they won't act naturally, right? They'll always be looking for, okay, you're trying to trick me, or you're maybe going to do something bad to me. I got to be on guard, and that would negatively impact the validity of the findings, making the data less useful, less valid, less reliable. Right? So we need a public to have confidence that, hey, we're going to be honest when doing research. We're not going to hurt you, and we're not going to lie to you unless we have to. More about that in a minute. And then lastly, we need ethical standards in research to protect people's intellectual property rights. Right? The people conducting the research have a right to get credit for what they do. And if they don't, then we end up disincentivizing scientific research, right? Well, if I'm going to go out and do this study and find these things, and somebody else can just take credit for my ideas, all right, well, why do it? Or at the very least, why share it, right? I'm not going to share it till the very end. I'm going to be kind of like those paranoid inventors where, okay, I'm going to get my research, 3 studies done, all the results ready, and then I'm going to publish them, rather than what typically is done. You publish the first one while planning the second one and then the third one. If you do that, you're going to slow down the process of research, right? Research, as we've talked about before, by nature is collaborative and additive. And if people are hoarding their findings and not releasing them until they're exactly ready for the whole thing to be out there, it's going to slow down progress significantly. Okay, so what standards are we talking about? Well, one of the big ones is the things standards are based on is the Belmont Report, which came out in 1979, and this came out largely in response to public outcry when we learned about the Tuskegee syphilis study. When people found out what researchers had done, there was thankfully a general outcry that, hey, something needs to be done. There needs to be some rules in place to keep them from victimizing people further. So the three kind of key pieces of the Belmont Report were that there should be standards that reflect a respect for persons, a value of beneficence, so do good, and then also the value of justice, which we'll talk more about in a bit. Subsequent to that, federal policy was developed in response to the Belmont Report. In 1981, you had the Common Rule was published, revised in 1991, and is set to be revised again. I think they just voted to delay it. It was supposed to be revised 2018, but now I think it's delayed till January 2019 to go into effect. And this is federal policy. The Common Rule talks about if you're getting any federal funding for research as an institution, you've got to follow the Common Rule, which one of the big things in the Common Rule is you have to have an institutional review board, right, an IRB. IRBs are these organizations that have to have at least 5 members. You've got to have scientists and also non-scientists. You also have to have a community member, somebody who's not at the institution. So at A&M Central Texas, we have an IRB, an institutional review board, and we've got some professors in there, staff. I think you've got a pastor from the community who's a non-scientist and community member, and then another, I think, a city council person. And the IRBs review applications for research. They say, hey, I want to do a study. Here's what I'm going to do. And the IRB does this kind of cost-benefit analysis, determining, okay, what risks are there to participants, what benefits are there to participants and benefits to society from this research. For the risks that are there, what protections are there to protect participants? And then they have to give approval for the people to conduct the research. So it gets IRB reviewed before you can even do your study. In addition to that, many professional organizations have ethics codes. The one that's probably most relevant for us is the APA's ethics code. Even people who aren't psychologists, who are counselors, but doing research in behavioral research or psychological research, APA just has the research section of their ethics code is more well developed than some of the other professional mental health counseling association type codes, because they tend to do a little bit less research. And those ethics codes aren't law, right? So they aren't binding to non-members. But whenever, let's say you're not an APA member, but you go and do some research, and then something goes south, one of the participants isn't happy, and they decide to sue you in civil court. Whenever the court is looking at, did you violate a standard of practice? Well, how do they know what the standard of practice is for research? Well, one thing they're going to look at is, well, what do the professional ethics codes out there say? And you say, well, I'm not a member of APA. Yeah, but a lot of people are. This is what most people are doing. This is what most people are following. Therefore, it is a standard of practice. So even if you're not a member, it's good to know these codes and adhere to them. Okay. In terms of the guiding principles to conducting research ethically, one, again, that kind of is an outgrowth of the Belmont Report, specifically, beneficence and non-maleficence. So do good and don't do bad, which really means we're supposed to protect research participants from harm, from physical harm and from psychological harm. Well, what types of harm might they be exposed to? One is stress, which emotional stress itself is another potential type of harm that can come from inflicted insight. It can come from other types of questions, even just like a survey where you're not even in a lab, you're at home on your computer doing an online survey. It still could cause emotional stress, right? If you're asking people questions about traumatic memories, childhood experiences, abuse experiences, the act of reading those questions and thinking back about those things can cause psychological harm, right? Can cause emotional distress. Another one we worry about is embarrassment and or harm to reputation. And this is about if your participation, what you do or what you say in a study, becomes known by other people, right? So related to this are concerns about privacy. Right? There's a general expectation, legally speaking, for most individuals, of privacy, that there are certain things that you know about yourself that people don't have a right to know. So privacy concerns generally are at the forefront of research out of the lab setting, out in the public, right? Where maybe we're going and observing people and they don't know we're observing them. And you can do some research like that where you're just observing people going in and out of a grocery store, and you're looking at who brings canvas bags with them and who doesn't, and ends up using the canvas bags. Maybe you're looking at age, gender, ethnicity, whatever, some sort of predictor of who's going to be the environmentally conscious recycler, right? To what degree is that an invasion of their privacy? Right? Now, from a legal standpoint, you don't have an expectation of privacy when you go to the grocery store. But from an ethical standpoint, we still have to consider, okay, that is somewhat of an invasion of privacy. How far can I go? So observing you go to the grocery store, how can I do that? Watching parents play with their children on a playground, is that okay? So how far can you go without asking people permission to observe them? Now, in terms of embarrassment, harm to reputation, we also have to be concerned about if they know they're participating. So we've asked them to participate, they've consented to participate, and now we have some knowledge about them, we have data, and either those data will be kept confidential, or they might be given and received anonymously, right? So if they're going to be anonymous, that means that when people participate, nobody knows whose data came from which person, right? Or potentially even who participated, right? So you're not going to ask them for the name, birthday, that type of stuff. But just because you don't ask for identifying information doesn't mean that people's participation will be anonymous, particularly if you're in a dealing with a unique population, right? So if you're looking at let's say Asian American individuals at A&M Central Texas who also identify as bisexual. Okay, now we're talking about a smaller population, and if part of your data, includes this participant who is a first-generation citizen of the U.S., right? The parents immigrated here. Okay, now there may be several people who on campus who, when they read that study, go, "Oh, I know who that one is. I know who that person. Yeah, I know their parents were immigrants, and they're Asian American, and they're bisexual. Yep, I know who that one is." Right? Don't have their name, don't have their birth date, but you have enough information to figure out who it is. Right? So it's not anonymous. Maybe it was intended to be anonymous, but it wasn't. So you have to be mindful of that when collecting data, especially from small groups, and if you're supporting small numbers of participants. Generally, though, what we promise to participants is to keep their data confidential, right? So even if you're going to maybe ask them the names and you know who it is, and sometimes you need to have it confidential and not anonymous, especially if you're going to do follow-ups like a pre-post. Really hard to do pre-post anonymously. It's possible, but it's tricky, right? You have to get them, okay, make up some own 6-digit code in your head that you're going to remember 3 months from now, whenever participation comes up again. But again, I can't email you to say, hey, it's time to participate, because if I have your email address, it's not anonymous. You just have to come back to me and participate again. So oftentimes we'll go with confidential, so we'll know who you are. But typically what researchers do is, after you participate, they de-identify the data, right? So we know who you are long enough to enter the data, and maybe do a pre-post. Okay, we've got post. Okay, cool. Now we're going to strip out all the names, any kind of usernames, identifying numbers, whatever, because we don't need that information. We don't need to store it. So we de-identify it just in case a computer gets hacked or whatever. Well, that part of the document's been deleted, or maybe it wasn't even entered. We collected the hard copy, didn't enter that part, and then shredded the papers to keep it confidential. And even de-identified data will still be protected, right? It needs to be typically behind 2 locks, and preferably if it's stored electronically, behind password particular entry and an encrypted file, right? So something we take pretty seriously is protecting people's data, so that they don't become embarrassed, or there's no harm to their reputation because of their participation in a study, right? So if you ask people like how much they drink or if they've done drugs, If they aren't confident that nobody's going to know what they said, they're going to be less than honest about those types of questions. And so we need to take steps to ensure that we can maintain their confidentiality and people won't know if they participated or what they said. Okay, so there's all these potential types of harm. Well, what's the evidence for whenever harm is inflicted? People do experience maybe some emotional distress or inflicted insight that this carries over. Well, it's something we've looked at empirically, and it seems to be there isn't a lot of evidence for lasting harm for your kind of more modern research. Obviously, things like the Tuskegee study, yeah, lasting harm, undeniable. But since we've had standards in place and checks and balances, protections, the type of research that's being done now, yeah, people might get upset, but typically we've got enough protections in place that that distress is transitory, and there doesn't seem to be evidence of significant lasting harm in any kind of widespread basis. So that's good. Another guiding principle is respect for persons and their autonomy. Right? And one of the big things here is they have to have the freedom to choose to participate or not to participate. Right? And they have to have that freedom without coercion. And this is something that we talk a lot about on the IRB, especially in an academic setting, if a professor is conducting a study, right? And they announce to us, hey, I'm doing a study, anybody wants to participate, just log into this website. It needs to be made very clear to those students that you participating in that study isn't going to make your papers get graded easier. You saying, no, I'm not going to be in that study isn't going to make your papers being graded harder. There should be no reward or punishment for participating in that study from this person who is in a position of power over you, who has the potential ability to coerce you into participating, right? Another thing about coercion we have to keep in mind, something that people don't often think about, is if you're going to compensate people for participating in a study, which if you have a longer study or maybe something that has some discomfort or risk associated, you might be more likely to say, oh, yeah, here's some compensation, some reward for you participating. If that reward becomes too great, it can become coercive. And in particular, it can become disproportionately coercive, right? To somebody who's making, working their 2 minimum wage jobs, raising 3 kids, and you say, okay, we're going to have this study where you're going to have to submerge your hand in a bucket of ice water, doing this pain study, to see how long you can tolerate pain. If you tell that person working their 2 minimum wage jobs with their 3 kids, yeah, we're going to give you $100 to do this. It's going to hurt a lot, but $100. They have less ability to say no than somebody who's making, 6 figures. Somebody's making 6 figures a year. Oh, it hurt a lot? $100? No, I'm good, thanks. Right? So there's a disproportionate level of coercion there you have to be sensitive to. So when you think about, oh, is this coercive? You can't just think about, oh, for me, well, it wouldn't be coercive for me. For other people in other situations, could that level of compensation that you're offering be coercive? Could it take away their ability to choose freely and say no? So they have to have that freedom to choose, participate at the beginning and also at any other time, right? So the freedom to withdraw from a study. And this is where it gets a little murky with compensation, right? So if you say, okay, if you do the study, you get $5, and somebody says, okay, cool, $5, it's not bad, I'll do it. And they start the study, and partway through they go, this makes me feel bad. I don't want to do it anymore. Do they still get the $5? And that's where it's a gray area. And typically it depends on how much they did. If they just, did the first question, maybe not. If they got halfway through, yeah, probably give them the $5. Better safe than sorry. You don't want to for it to be seen as coercion. If you're going, you're uncomfortable, you want to quit, but you won't get your $5 if you quit. And then they stay in. Okay, now they stayed in because of the conversation, and it's moving back toward that coercion. So that is a bit of a gray area for a lot of people. Also related to having respect for people's autonomy, right? Whenever they have the freedom to choose, they must choose. That choice must be an informed one, right? So you must have not just consent, but informed consent. So what do they need to be informed about? Well, obviously about what's going to happen to them, the procedures that they're going to undergo, the duration, how long is it going to take, basic information like that. The potential risks, right? which even really benign studies, like just a survey, has some risk. Typically, the risk is a breach of confidentiality. Somebody could break into my house, steal my laptop, take it to a hacker. They could break through the firewalls and get the data. Well, it could happen. Unlikely. But you have to talk about the risks that they may put themselves at risk for by participating, but also any benefits of the research, benefits to them and benefits to society at large. Doing this study will help us understand better how to treat psoriasis, whatever it is. There'll be a statement about confidentiality and privacy. So how far are you going to go? What are you going to look at? What are you not going to look at? How are you going to protect their confidentiality? Will it be anonymous or not? If not, how are you going to protect the information they give to you from others? Who to contact with questions or concerns. And typically this will be at least 2 contacts here. One will be the researcher, like here's contact information for the researcher, but you also need to have a contact for if the researcher did something that made you uncomfortable or you have concerns about, who do I talk to? And typically that would be a representative designated by the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, that is there to provide some oversight. A statement about choice, kind of reminding them that you're free to participate or not. There'll be no penalties for not participating, and you can withdraw at any time. And then for treatment studies, so here's this study. We have this therapy for depression. If you want to be in our study, you can get this therapy. And then, but if you're depressed and you need treatment, but you don't want to be in our study, here's some other numbers to call. Here's a free clinic. You have to give them some other alternatives. You can't just be, hey, here's our treatment. I don't know if there's anything else out there. You probably should be depressed. Too bad. Right? You have to give them alternatives if you're doing a treatment study. Justice. And this is one that we've actually touched on a bit already in terms of the coercion, right? Where if you have a compensation that's pretty high, it can end up being coercive to one group more than another, a disadvantaged group, which is unjust, right? Because they're bearing more of the burden of research than others. In addition to that, when this happens, and often it happens that the people that bear the burden of research, especially kind of risky research that is uncomfortable, or there's side effects, it's typically your disadvantaged people because they're going to give them some compensation that's going to get them to do this, right? And that still happens a lot, but it can be compounded, it can be worse, a greater injustice if one community bears the majority of risks and then the benefits. So we have some drug we're studying, and we test this drug on all these, let's say what we really do, third world countries. We test it out there, and then once we know the drug works, we don't give them any of the drug that works. We bring that back stateside, and we use it in our own healthcare system, right? So they bear all the risks, and we get all the benefits. That is unjust and therefore unethical. Also important to keep in mind in terms of justice, to be mindful of when working with vulnerable populations, right? And this is something that the Common Rule has designated a couple of vulnerable populations in particular in the States when doing research. Individuals whose primary language isn't English, right? Because if you're going to get informed consent, you need to get informed consent in their native tongue. Pregnant women are considered a vulnerable population because of the developing fetus. Prisoners are a vulnerable population because they have obviously less freedom. So it's much easier to take advantage of people in prison when doing research, to subject them to things, very small rewards. Even saying, hey, we're not going to give you anything, but you're going to get out of your cell block and come over to this nicer medical facility for 2 hours every week if you participate in the study, or we're injecting you with something. Don't worry about what it is, right? Yeah, at least I get out of my cell block. Sure. So there's some extra protections in there to protect vulnerable populations, to make sure we're not unjustly targeting those who may be at greater risk. Another guiding principle is that of trust, which we talked before about. If we violate the public's trust consistently, it has a variety of negative implications. But sometimes we do use deception, right? So when is it necessary to use deception in behavioral research? Typically, whenever people aren't going to be honest or genuine in their responses, you might need to use deception, right? So if you're studying, racism, stereotypes, people aren't usually going to say, "Yeah, I'm super racist." Don't isolate that audio. People aren't going to be honest about that, so you may have to use some deception, some subterfuge to get at these things that people don't want to admit about themselves. A variety of studies in social psych use deception for that reason, because when people know they're being watched and they know they're being watched by a particular behavior, they're going to act differently than they would normally or naturally. Right? So for the APA ethics code, you can use deception, but you can only use it if you couldn't do the study otherwise, and with some other provisos as well. Potential consequences for if we use deception. As we talked about before, using deception can make people, the public can become distrusting of researchers, which make them less likely to participate, and when they do participate, more likely to act unnaturally and be on edge and be looking for the deception. So that can be problematic. So for APA, you can use it if it's necessary, if you can minimize negative consequences, and then you have to have debriefing, right? So after you're done collecting your data, you have to tell them what's up, right? And typically you do this in a post-experimental interview, right? So after the experiment, you have an interview and you talk about, okay, here's where we lied to you, right? And as part of that interview, you may do a suspicion check, right? So before you tell them where you lied, you ask them, hey, where do you think we lied, right? You tell them, can't remember the name of who it was, when, had an example in there about, you tell them, not everything in this study was as it seems. What do you think wasn't the way that we presented it to you, right? So you just kind of look for, oh, I totally knew that that person I was talking to was a Confederate. I knew they were a friend of yours and not another participant. Or, oh yeah, I totally knew there wasn't really a person in the room. It was a recording, whatever it is. Oh, I knew you weren't looking at, how fast I could write. You were looking at stereotypes, whatever. You're trying to see did they guess, were they suspicious of what happened, and that's something else you can code as another variable in your study to look. Okay, did participants who were more suspicious and maybe guessed what was happening, did they act differently than those who didn't? Right? And then obviously at some point you're going to tell them the truth and ask them, don't tell your friends because we're still running the study. And the other thing you might need to do, if part of what you did in your study caused some harm, right? You caused some emotional distress, you may do some process debriefing, right? This is where you're undoing harm, right? Because maybe you're doing something where you wanted to look at people's memory for particular words when in a negative mood state. So you induced a negative mood state by having them watch Schindler's List, right? Okay, so you made them feel bad. And that's super bad, maybe. They're not going to hurt themselves, but still, they're feeling less well than when they came in, and you did that on purpose. Right? So in a process debriefing, you now will do the opposite. You do a positive mood induction, right? So whatever you did, you find some way to undo it. If you gave them some maybe false feedback about themselves, that they were horrible at something, right? Kind of to drop their self-esteem. Okay, now you need to do something to increase their self-esteem, right? And if you're clever enough to figure out how to do the negative thing, typically you'd be clever enough to figure out how to do the reverse. Okay, so on to the ethical reporting of research findings. So scientific integrity is another one of the kind of guiding principles that applies here. Things to consider. Researchers should always report if they have any financial conflicts of interest, and they should try to minimize those if they can. Again, a lot of research can't be done without funding, right? If you're going to, especially medical research, drug research, it's expensive to do, and the only people paying for it are the drug companies. So it's not unethical to take their money to do the research. It is unethical not to tell people you took their money, right? So you need to report all sources of funding that you got that might represent any kind of conflict of interest. So people can say, okay, yeah, you found this drug worked, but you were paid by that company. I'm going to look at it a little more suspect versus, You found the drug didn't work, and you're paid by that company. Oh, it must really not work because they paid you to say it worked and it didn't. So you report your conflicts of interest, and that includes, if you hold stock in a company that you're investigating, which you shouldn't do that, by the way. You should divest yourself of those things. Falsification of data, we talked about a little bit already, the Andrew Wakefield type stuff. There's a commitment to not falsifying data, right? Report what you found. Even if it's not what you wanted, you still report it. This still happens, right? People still do falsify the data. It's foolish because we live in a world of replication, and if you falsify your data and people fail to replicate, eventually they come back and go, hey, can we see original data? And you're going to be found out, and then your academic reputation will be ruined, and your career will be over. So don't falsify data. More problematic, I think, would be incomplete reporting of results, right? Where somebody ran 5 different tests. Only one of them had results they wanted. The other 4 were contrary to what they wanted, and they just report the one as if that's the only one they ran. That's also unethical. You need to report the full body of what you did so people know, okay, yeah, you found this one thing, but you missed on 4 others. That's important information. Duplicate publication and piecemeal publication. So ethical codes, especially APA, prohibits you if you do a study and you submit it to a journal and it's published, you can't now go submit that same study to a different journal. You can only publish it one place. Similarly with piecemeal publication, let's say you do a study, big study on college students looking at predictors of academic success, and you've got maybe 5 predictors you looked at. And rather than writing a paper that talks about those 5 predictors, you write one paper on one predictor. Hey, here's looking at the relationship between amount of TV watching and academic success. Here's another paper on number of friends you have and academic success. But really, you measure all those things at once, but you're chopping up the study unnecessarily into multiple papers. That's called piecemeal publication. So duplicate publication and piecemeal publication are problematic. They're unethical because it makes it look like there's more research out there than there really is, right? Because people don't know. People, when they're doing their lit search, they say, okay, oh, here's 5 different studies by Jones and Smith about these predictors of academic success. Wow, they've really done a lot of research on this. No, that was one study, right? So you need to be forthright, accurate in your reporting of results. Report what you really found and report all of it, warts and all. If you had to, you had some wonky data in your study, you said, wow, this one participant clearly just put all ones when answering, so we had to throw them out. You can do that. You can throw that data out, but you need to report it. Data from this many participants were eliminated due to random responding or whatever your reason is. You tell people when you're not reporting all the data. Last thing under this, intellectual property rights. In terms of authorship, you get authorship on a paper, a research paper for publication, if you made significant contributions to conducting the research or writing. Primarily, it's for writing. If you didn't write anything and you were just involved in conducting it, it's harder to get authorship unless it was your idea, right? So if you had an idea for a study, you designed the study, told people what to do and all that, and somebody else writes the paper, okay, you're probably still getting authorship. Now, if you were just running subjects, right? So if people were coming into a lab and sitting down at a computer and going through a protocol, and you're the one who's there telling them what to do, yeah, come in here, sit here, and then you're going to hit this. When the screen comes on, hit the L whenever you see a red dot. Okay, you may not get authorship for that. You might get in a footnote or a thank you. But one of the things that's important in the academic community is that people understand what level of authorship, what level of involvement is required to get authorship, right? And then in addition to getting your name on the paper, where your name goes, right? Because in our field, it matters. Some fields it doesn't. Oh, it's alphabetical. In ours, typically, the first author is the one with the greatest contribution, and then descending from there down to the last author, you have less contributions. Although more journals now are allowing people to report if there were equal contributions, to say that, okay, the names are in this order, but really, it was an equal contribution. If that's not said, then it's the order that it goes in. And for students, if you ever do a dissertation for your doctoral work, and if that work gets published, almost always the student should be first author if it's their dissertation, unless there's some sort of exceptional circumstance where maybe they did the dissertation and then lost interest in it and didn't, and then the paper was significantly revised, maybe some more data were added. Maybe they wouldn't be first author anymore, but generally, if it's your dissertation, you're going to be first author. Okay. Last thing, plagiarism, which talk obviously a lot more about in the plagiarism video, something that's very important in terms of the ethics of research. You don't take credit for other people's work. Data, methodology, their words, right? You give people credit. And again, it's a collaborative field, and you're going to use what people used before, but you give appropriate credit when doing so, and then it's all kosher, it's all fine. Okay, research on non-human participants. There's an ongoing and will be an ongoing debate regarding the rights of non-human animals. Some people think that there shouldn't be any research done on non-human animals because they can't consent to participate, and therefore all research on animals is unethical. Obviously, the people that hold that opinion aren't in charge because animal research goes on. And overall, the current viewpoint seems to be that it's ethical if the animals are treated humanely and if there are sufficient benefits to the research. So you can't just willy-nilly do research on animals. There are going to be some protections there, right? Where, okay, we understand that there is a cost to this other life form to being in this study. Will what we learn from their participation in this study be important enough to deserve that cost, right? And that's a tough call, but it's one that IRBs have to struggle with and have to kind of make some decisions about. So they're doing that cost-benefit analysis, but in addition to that, there are some other regulations in terms of anybody doing animal research. There's several types of training that are required in terms of safe handling of the animals, protecting them, improving their welfare, in between the study, making sure they're housed appropriately, fed appropriately, cared for, their health. They're in situations that aren't. If it's not required for the research, then it shouldn't cause them pain. So maybe some research that causes pain, okay, but if they're not doing the thing that causes pain, okay, when they're in their cage, it shouldn't be a cage that causes them pain, discomfort. It should be something nice. So we want to minimize any harm or pain that is experienced by the animals, a recognition that they do experience pain, and then also use as few animals as possible. So like doing the mathematics, and okay, to find what we need to find, what's the fewest number of rats that we need to run through this maze? Okay. All right, wrapping up. Standards are clearly needed, right? Without them in the past, bad things happened. Without them now, bad things would happen again. Because, again, there are pressures on researchers to go as far as the rules will allow. So we need to keep the rules in place and be vigilant about them. There's a balance that has to be struck between protecting participants and getting good data, right? That's often what goes on in the cost-benefit analysis, deciding if a study should be approved or not. Because sometimes to get the good data, we have to, we need to cause a little pain. We need to use a little deception. But we can't go too far to where we're putting people in danger, causing irreparable harm, harming the reputation of the field. So it's this balancing act. How far can we go to get the good data without jeopardizing research participants? And it is a balancing act. It's one that requires personal vigilance on the part of researchers, right? So you can't just rely on, there's all these rules there, so somebody will tell me if I do it wrong. No, every researcher involved in behavioral research is individually responsible for doing the right thing, watching what they're doing, and watching their colleagues to make sure they're doing the right thing. In addition to personal vigilance, you also have to have institutional oversight, right? That's where we have IRBs come in, because people are going to have blind spots. You're not going to notice something sometimes that you're doing, and so you need to be vigilant yourself, but you also need that overwatch from others. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.